Hello and welcome back to Indie Rebel VFX, Hollywood effects without a Hollywood budget. I'm your instructor, Chris Temple, and in this video we're going to go over the basics of node-based compositing. I'm going to teach you what nodes are, how they work, and probably why they're better than layers for most of the visual effects work that you might be doing on your independent feature films. So if you can't wait to get going, let's get started and I'll show you the basics of nodes. Welcome back to Natron. I do hope you get used to this interface because we are going to be spending a lot of time in here together throughout this course. So what I want to do now is give you guys kind of a primer about node-based compositing, how it works, how it's different than layer-based compositing, and then I'm going to take you guys through a sample project using just some nodes that come with Natron, not bringing in any extra footage or anything like that, just so you can get a feel for working with nodes and kind of get comfortable with this kind of workflow. So to start off, I want to add two nodes into my scene, and we're going to add a checkerboard and we're going to add a color wheel. Now there's a few different ways I can add nodes to my shot. First though, we need to understand how this interface is laid out. Starting up here at the top, we have what's called our viewer. This is essentially like the preview window that you would have in After Effects. This shows you your final output or whatever output of nodes you're choosing to view at that point in time. As we talked about in the last video, you have your properties over here. This is where you're going to go ahead and change, in this case, project settings. But later on, as we start adding nodes, you can change the effect properties here. And in the bottom, we have our graphs. This particular graph that we see by default is the node graph. You can tell because that's what it says right here. We also have a curve editor and a dope sheet as well. And both of these will really come in handy when we start doing some keyframe animations later on. So we want to be in our node graph. And then finally, we have one last row over here, and this is where we can actually kind of browse through the different nodes that we have available to us. And we can come in here and choose something that we want. In this case, oh look, checkerboard, that's what I wanted to add. So we can click on the checkerboard and you can see it adds it into our shot. Now by default, as you can see, this viewer connected itself to the checkerboard. And these little connection lines is how nodes essentially are connected to one another. And this line is extremely important. If I disconnect it like this and let go, you can see there's black. There's nothing for the viewer, which is this, and this viewer is tied to this window right here. There's nothing for it to see. Now, there's a few ways I can connect this back to the checkerboard. I can drag the arrow coming off the bottom of the checkerboard to the viewer. Okay, we'll disconnect that. I can drag this number 1 from the viewer up to my checkerboard, and that'll work. I can also select my checkerboard just by clicking on it once and press 1 on the keyboard. And that will bring my 1 connection up to there as well. Let's go and add another node. We want to add a color wheel, and I'll show you a different way you can do that. One of my favorite ways to add a node, if there's not a keyboard shortcut already assigned to it, is to simply click off in the node graph, press tab on the keyboard, and type the name of the node that I want to add. In this case, I want to add color wheel, and you can see I start typing color, and anything that has to do with color pops up in the search. And in this case, here's one called color wheel. That's the one that I'm wanting. So now I have two nodes, right? I can switch from one to another either by dragging and dropping my connector, and you can see it now switches to the color wheel. We can also come back to the checkerboard and do that. Or I can click on the color wheel and press 1. I can click on the checkerboard and press 1. And we can bounce back and forth that way. Now we can also click on one of the nodes and press 2. And now you can see I've essentially have two connectors coming into my viewer, and with the viewer selected, pressing either 1 or 2 will dictate which node I am viewing, which strand is coming into my viewer at this point. So really what you're starting to see here is that nodes is all about signal flow and data flow. In other words, if we look really close here, by the way, I use my middle mouse button to zoom in and out, and once I'm zoomed in too far, I can use Alt to pan around the shot a little bit. If you notice, everything is made up of these arrows. These connectors are actually arrows, and they tell us how the data flows. So I have data coming from the checkerboard into my viewer down over here. And if I zoom out, you can see it's connected to the viewer, and you just follow the direction of the arrow. What this means is that I can come into a project 3 months later after I was in it, and because I know how to read a node graph, I know what my readers are, I know what these look like, I know what rotos look like. We'll look at those in a bit. All you have to do is just follow the arrows, and it becomes real easy to see how you set a project up in the first place. So what I want to do now is kind of illustrate how layers work, and then we'll show you how nodes actually work when it comes to compositing something on top of each other. So we're going to disconnect that, throw our viewer off to the side, we don't need that. And right now I just want to play with my checkerboard and my color wheel. Now we're going to zoom in here and make this easier to illustrate. In a layer-based paradigm such as HitFilm or After Effects, you simply stack your layers on top of each other, and the order that they are stacked tells you what order they are viewed. So if I want to put my color wheel on top of the checkerboard, you would pretty much set up your layers just like this. Now in a layer-based paradigm, you also work with a concept of time. In nodes, you work with time, but you work with it a little bit differently. You're not trimming the length of a clip here in order to dictate how long the shot is on screen, okay? It doesn't work that way. You start using dope sheets and curve editors to control time, so that's what these are here for. So while this is what you would do in a layer-based setup in order to put your color wheel on top of the checkerboard, in a layer-based setup, we have something called a merge node that accomplishes the same effect. To add a merge node into our scene, I can either go ahead and press tab and type merge, and you can see it'll pop up right there. I can also come over here to this group of nodes, which is my merge group, and wouldn't you know it, there's a merge node in here you can add. Or my favorite way to do it is to simply press M on the keyboard, and as you can see by pressing M, the merge appears. Now the merge, as you may notice, has a few different inputs into it. We've got A, B, A2, and a mask. And these will make more sense as we go, but for right now, all you need to know is that B stands for background, and A is your foreground, and you can simply think of it as being, in this case, A over, because you can see it says over, B. So watch what happens now. If I go ahead and I hook up my B to my checkerboard, because I want that to be my background, I'm just going to line it up like this, and then I take my A and connect it to my color wheel, and with my merge selected, I press 1 on the keyboard to view it. I now have my color wheel on top of that checkerboard background. So what we've done is we've stacked it at this point. That's exactly what you would do in After Effects. You put your color wheel on top of your checkerboard. We've done that here with nodes. Now, let's say this color wheel is looking a little bit big and I want to go and shrink that down a little bit. How would I do that? Well, what's really cool with nodes is there's actually a node for that. There's a node for everything that you want to do to the image. Rather than clicking on your color wheel and trying to go through a bunch of properties to find your transform options and then changing your rotation and scale and positioning through there, we simply add what's called a transform node, and now I know that I've made transformations to the shot. To add a transform node, you can go search for it like we've done before, or in this case, I can just press T on the keyboard and the node appears. Now there's two ways I can drop this into my shot. I can either simply drag and drop it onto the A pipe, and you can see it hooked itself right in there, and this little crosshatch thing appears over there. Or I can also, if I delete that, select my color wheel and press T, and it will insert a transform in line with everything else. It just goes right below whichever node I have selected. And you can do that with a lot of different things. In fact, you can even do it with a merge. If I delete what I have there, I select my color wheel, press M to merge, you can see that gets dropped in through the A pipe, and then all I have to do is drag it over and connect my B, and I'm ready to continue. So let's go and view that merge, and we'll add our transform into the node graph here again. So now with the transform selected, by the way, you double click a node to select them, I now have these options. I can translate it, rotate it, scale it, and do all sorts of fun stuff. So let's go and just scale this wheel down a little bit. About like that looks good. And if I use these control widgets here, I can actually just go and put this up here to the top left corner of my screen. And that works just like any other compositing suite that you may be familiar with. And let's go and add some rotation to it too. We're going to make this a little bit interesting. We're going to do our first animation. I want to go and rotate it. We'll just rotate that all the way back, and you can see by changing the rotation what it does over here to the color wheel in the shot. So I want to rotate that all the way to the end, just like that. Now we're going to add some keyframes, and the way we add keyframes is real simple. You just right click on the property that you want to keyframe and hit set key. So I want to keyframe my translate, and I want to keyframe my rotation. So I hit set key for both of those. I'm now going to go to frame 30, which will be the end of our animation ultimately. And I'm just going to drag this now to the other corner like so. You can see instantly another keyframe has been added. Let's go and take a look at that here. I'm going to zoom into my timeline, pan over with Alt. If I move this into the middle, you can see that that ball animates from side to side, and you can see some little blue hashes here. In fact, if you notice, watch this number, the frame counter here. that turns blue when I land on a keyframe. So simply by moving forward in time and moving your objects on the screen, the keyframes get updated automatically, which is really, really helpful. So if I want to go ahead and play this, I can. I just hit play, go to the beginning, and you can see that it animates across the screen. And then we've got all these extra frames here, and it just sits there, and I don't want that. So let's go and trim our shot down. To do that, we simply, anywhere in the screen, press S to bring up our settings. And now I can choose how long I want this to be. I want this to be 30 frames long. Hit enter, and you can see my shot has instantly been trimmed. And now if I go back to the beginning and play this, we'll find that it simply goes on loop. All right, well, let's go and make this a bit more interesting. Maybe I want to add a keyframe right here in the center. So I can go to frame 15, and we will double click our transform, and we can just drag this down, boom, to here. And oh, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to add my rotation a little bit more. So I'm gonna go back to my last frame. And if you look now, by the way, you can see how the ball is now going in this arch shape, which looks really nice. I'm gonna go to frame 30, and I'm gonna turn my rotation all the way down this way. I'm gonna double click my merge in order to clear this crosshair, just like that. And if we go to the beginning of our shot and play it, you can see how the ball rotates down, and it looks like it's just bouncing off the bottom of the frame. And that's all there is to it. You've now done your first animation in Natron using just keyframes and some built-in effects. But we're not done yet. We got a few more things we want to do. If we look at the animation on this, it looks good, but it's not quite believable. And that's because in the real world, there's something called motion blur, which means that as it moves through a shot, as an object moves through your scene, it actually blurs out. And we can add motion blur in here really easy by double-clicking our transform, coming down to the motion blur options, and we're just going to change that to 1. If I double click back on my merge, you can see instantly that color wheel got a little bit blurry. And if we play the shot again, and now we've got a much more realistic form of motion. Now I do apologize, I ended up cutting about a minute out of this recording because I'm on a laptop and I'm trying to do the screen recording at the same time that Natron is running and trying to calculate this motion blur. Motion blur does take a lot longer to calculate than not having motion blur, and so it's usually a good rule of thumb to leave your motion blur off until you're ready to do your final render. But in this case, I wanted to turn it on. You guys can see how that looks, and that looks pretty good. So we'll go and stop that there, and I'm going to turn the motion blur off for now. And the way we do that is simply by coming back into motion blur and changing that to 0. And you can see that gets shut off. So that is kind of just the basics of nodes, and that's really how node-based compositing works, and all we're going to do from here on out is simply more of the same. For instance, you can come into your merges here, and you can see there's different operations for the merges. This is like all your different blending modes that you're used to from other compositing apps. You've got screen, soft light, over is the one by default, you've got multiply, plus is the same thing as add. We don't actually have add, but plus is the same thing. If you're ever curious what these different operations are, simply hover your mouse over it, and you can see that all the equations pop up because a merge is simply math. And so if you're curious about the math, now you know how the math works. I'm not much of a math guy though, so I typically ignore that. I'll just scroll through these until I find one that looks good for the shot that I'm trying to do. All right, now that we've covered a merge and transforming, let's go ahead and get a little bit freaky with this, all right? What I want to do now is show you guys one of the main reasons that I feel nodes are better than layers, and that is simply because there is no more pre-composing. When I learned visual effects on After Effects, initially I thought pre-composing or pre-comping was one of the neatest things there was because it allowed me to basically render a shot without rendering a shot, and I could keep adding effects to it. My background in VFX actually came from my nonlinear editor. I was working in Sony Vegas, and I would do all my compositing in there, so I got used to working with layers. And I knew that sometimes I needed to actually render a shot out first in order to have an effect apply to multiple pieces of it without affecting other parts. So those of you guys that are coming from After Effects, you know what I'm talking about. You also now know just how big of a pain pre-comps are. It's a pain in the butt. I hate it because pretty soon with some complicated shots, you get shots that are 4 or 5 pre-comps deep and you can't keep track of anything that you're doing a week later. It's absolutely insane. What's really cool with nodes is we don't have pre-comps anymore because this merge not just stacks footage, but they also effectively act as a pre-comp. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to add a color bar to my shot, which I have right here. And I'm going to make this my new background, okay? So I'm going to take this merge, select it, press M, move this down over here, and connect that up. Now I like to work left to right and top to down, okay? Left to right, top to down, and that just makes it real easy for me to come back into a shot and know how I need to read the node graph. So let me go and recenter this up just a little bit here. And so we take our color bars, and we got the merge, but we can't see the color bars, and that's because this checkerboard is covering the whole thing. Now, even though we're viewing this final merge of the color wheel on top of the checkerboard, which all that should be on top of the color bars, we can't see that because this checkerboard is the same size as the color bar. You can see that they're still filling an HD frame. So what we need to do is we need to find some way to mask off this section here, and that's what we're going to do now with a roto. So I'm just going to click off here to the side. I'm going to press O for roto. That's my favorite way to add it. And you can see this fuchsia colored node appears because we made it fuchsia. And it also draws your attention to some new controls that have appeared up here. Okay? And so what we can do is with this right here, we can choose to do a Bezier, ellipse, or a rectangle. We're just going to do a Bezier for now to start with. But it's just your basic roto shapes. And I want to just go ahead and draw like a little zigzaggy line like that. And then maybe on this next one, I want to curve it. So I click and drag rather than just solid clicking. So we put a curve in there. And then I'm going to click solid and click solid again to get out of that. And let's see, we'll zoom out a little bit with the middle mouse. Alt up. And there we go, just like that. Now we can take this roto, and if I go back to my merge, if you look, this mask option appears. Let me just drag the mask into the roto. And you can see sections start to get cut out. Now I actually want my color bars to be in this side, not on that side. So all you do is go into your merge that the roto is piped into, and there's an option here to invert the mask. Just check the box, and you can see that it flips. Check it again, it goes back to the way it was. Pretty simple. So what you need to know really is just rotos go into a merge, and then the controls for how that roto is interacting is in the merge node. And what it's doing is it's affecting the A channel only, okay? So in this case, if I put it back to the way it was, let's see, uninvert that mask, the roto is only showing that part of the A. So the A is masked by that part of it. So by inverting the mask, like this, my roto is now, even though the roto is over here, it's actually only revealing this part of the image. So that's really how it works, and if you play with it for just a little bit, you'll really start to get a good feel for it. Now, one of the neat things about these roto nodes is we can feather the individual control points. This is something that After Effects didn't even have until recently, okay? And now you're already getting this in a free piece of software. All I can do is just come in here and grab these little wings, and that allows me to start, let's see, where's my wing? There it is. Grab the wing, and you can see it's adding a feather just to those vertices. Everything else stays the same. I can also double click my roto shape and come up here to shape, and there's a master feather, which will feather, as you can see by looking at it, feathers the entire shot. But I'm going to turn that feather off and just use this one for now. Roto nodes, like anything else, come in animated. You can see it's blue, and so if I come up, let's say, to frame 10, and I want to change my shape, maybe I want to do this to it, and now I go between the two, you can see how that roto shape is animated, so it makes it real easy to do your rotoscoping. Now I told you that these merges also act as precomps. So let me go and fill the frame here, and you'll see what I'm talking about. If I wanted to apply an effect just to my color wheel and checkerboard, but not to the color bars, in After Effects, you'd have to precomp this. And that's because we would be applying an effect only to layers that are on top of another layer. In this case, an adjustment layer won't work because it would apply it to all three of these, okay? It would go boom, 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 boom. We only want to apply it to these two. So how do we do that? We come after the merge and we add whatever effect we want to do. In this case, let's add a color correction. We do that by pressing C on the keyboard. And now we have a color corrector node, and you can see it got inserted between my two merges. So now, if I go ahead and I start playing with this, I'm just going to go down to my gain, bring up the color selector, and we're just going to make it blue like that, and hit OK. You can see that only affects this group of nodes here. It does not affect what's going on over here. And this becomes extremely powerful as we want to start changing things. Likewise, if I wanted to add a blur to the shot, and only blur the color bars, I could do that. I can just come to my color bars, press B, and start blurring those. And you can see it blurs them while still keeping my very hard mask edge. Now later on I'll show you how to actually blur everything, including the edge of the mask, but that's another lesson for another time. Right now, I think we've covered enough to get you guys started with these nodes. And again, if I go back to the beginning of my shot, I can play through and we can see all the animations that we've done. So you can see that really node-based compositing doesn't have to be that scary. It's actually quite simple. As long as you try to keep everything in here organized, I like to always have straight lines like this. And in my case, I work left to right, top to down. It's really easy to keep track of what's going on here in your shot and scene. So what we can do is just start to play at this point. You're not going to hurt anything. And let's just see, like as an example, if I click off to the side here, I go into my filters, Godrays. Let's play with that. That could be kind of fun. So I can take my Godrays effect right here, and I can stick it at the very bottom of my composition, which is going to affect everything. And we turn up the scale on that a little bit. Like, okay, well, that blurs everything. Okay, that's cool. Let's go and disconnect that there. And what happens if I add it to, let's see, let me view back into my merge. What if I put it only on the color wheel and checkerboard right after the color correction? Oh, okay, wow, interesting. So that only blurs that part of it. My point to you is that by starting to play with the nodes this way and just really experimenting and moving them around and learning how they connect and how the rotos work and doing some real simple animations without bringing in any footage yet, you're going to start to get a feel for how nodes work and kind of the nuances of it, because it really is a different way of thinking. But once your brain locks into it, it's so much easier than layers, and it's just going to click for you. And so my hope is that by the end of this course, you're going to be an expert at nodes. But right now, like I said, just go and spend 30 minutes, spend an hour playing with some of these nodes. And once you get comfortable, I will see you guys in the next lesson where I show you how to work with log footage. And then we'll go and we'll do our first real shot after that, okay? So go play for a bit, and I will see you guys in the next lesson.